We're always telling your stories, and it's time someone tells ours. We're humans first, journalists second. We chose this career to give you a voice. Now we're voicing ours. It's true, journalism has much room for improvement, but not all hope is lost, and we want your trust back by humanizing one journalist at a time. We're sharing with you what we go through to bring you the news. The pain, the tears, the trauma, and the mental health struggles. It's painful, and sometimes we even work 2 jobs to make ends meet. But we all have something in common. The passion, the joy, and the love we feel for storytelling and holding the powerful accountable. That includes holding ourselves accountable. So here are stories from us. This is how we want to help improve the news industry. The Awakened Journalist is proud to present Media Healers by Emiliana Molina Fajardo. Hi everyone, welcome back to The Awakened Journalist and our special project, Media Healers. Today's guest is Pilar Pedraza. She has been in the news industry for almost 2 decades, playing basically every single role there is to play in a broadcast newsroom. She's been a production assistant, a newsroom manager, a photographer, an anchor, and she's currently a TV host, anchor, and a senior political reporter at KAKE TV in Wichita, Kansas. She's been awarded multiple awards. Among these, there's the Iowa Broadcast News Association for Best Election Coverage, as well as the IBNA for Best Newscast, and an Edward R. Morrow Award for Team Reporting Breaking News, and many other awards as well. She's had a long career. And some of the major news stories throughout her career as well that she's covered have been 9/11 from Wichita, the 2000s presidential election in the United States, the explosion of the shuttle of Columbia, as well as the arrest of BTK, a killer who took the lives of 10 innocent people in the area of Wichita, Kansas. She also covered the devastating death of news reporter Alison Parker and photojournalist Adam Ward. We're going to go into a little bit of detail about that. And she is also a certified high school teacher with endorsements to teach Spanish, journalism, history, government, and she has a total of 7 years of classroom teaching experience. So Pilar, welcome and thank you for agreeing to do this interview.
Happy to be here. As you can tell from my teaching experience, I'm all about, kind of just sharing experiences and spreading the information so more people can understand what's going on, whether you're in the industry and you need backup for some reason, or you're not in the industry and you think it's one way, and guess what? If you're not in the industry, any way you think it is, it's probably not.
Yeah, that's a true statement. Pilar, so you started around the 90s. Tell me a little bit about how you got started in news and journalism.
Well, it's kind of an interesting story in and of itself to begin with. I actually grew up in journalism. My mother was a newspaper reporter, columnist, editor throughout much of my childhood. I literally grew up in newspaper newsrooms. They were weeklies. She always worked in small towns. Almost always. And so I can remember playing under the light tables as they were pasting together the newspaper for the week with my dolls, whatever, sitting next to her on my little toy phone, making my own beat calls while she was making her beat calls, stuff like that. So I literally grew up in the business. Going to city council meetings with her because they were in the evening and she was a single mom, and you know what? On a newspaper salary, especially at a weekly, you could not afford a babysitter. Going to fires in the middle of the night, sitting in the backseat of the car while she was covering the fire. So yeah, you can't have grown up in this business much more than I did. When I was in high school, though, I swore I was not going to be my mom. For a long time, and actually this goes back to middle school even, I thought I was going to be an actress. That's what I wanted to do. Well, as you can tell, I'm not exactly your standard sized actress. And eventually, this was back in a day and age when non-standard actresses just didn't exist on the screen.
Oh,
So I kind of put that idea to rest, but I always like to say I ran as far and as fast as I could from being my mother. I was not going to be a writer. I was not going to be a reporter. And I made it all the way down the street to the TV station.
you are 20 years later.
Yep. So I ran and I fought as hard as I could, but unfortunately it was a losing battle. Oh, and
my
by the way,
gosh.
after leaving newspaper, my mom became a teacher.
Wow. And you're teaching now too.
Well, actually, I'm not teaching now, but
You're not
yeah,
teaching now, okay.
yeah.
But you've taught
Yes,
journalism, right?
yes.
And
I've taught journalism, mostly Spanish though.
okay,
So,
gotcha.
but,
That's hilarious. Where are you from originally?
well, that's a complicated question in and of itself. I'm a Navy brat.
Okay.
So I grew up kind of all over the country,
Okay.
East Coast, West Coast, Upper Midwest, the South. I've been there.
Okay.
Mostly I claim Michigan because that's where my mom's family was from. So that was kind of home base. We kept every couple of years or so, we go back to Michigan for a year or so, and then we go off someplace else again. So I claim to be a Michigander, but I have as much experience outside of Michigan as I do in Michigan. In fact, Kansas is where I've lived longer than anywhere else in my entire life. And if somebody had told me when I moved here in 2001 that I would still be here in 2021, I would have laughed them out of the room.
And then, so where did you learn to speak Spanish?
In high school, actually. My father, his parents, they had suffered horrible discrimination. They came over when they were kids. They had fairly heavy Spanish accents. They came from Puerto Rico. And they had fairly heavy Spanish accents. And this was in the 30s and 40s. They suffered very heavy discrimination because of that, didn't want their kids to deal with that. And so my father and his brothers didn't grow up learning Spanish. I remember being shocked when I found that out. I was in middle school and the movie La Bamba had just come out. And so the song was playing on the radio all the time. And I asked my dad, translate this. What does it mean? And he's like, I don't speak Spanish. And I'm like, what are you talking about? You're a Pedraza.
Yeah.
So my Spanish is mostly from school.
Okay.
I learned it in high school, and then I studied at La Universidad de Valladolid in Spain when I was in college for a semester. So, and that's why you'll notice I have, for those who are Spanish speakers, I have La Teta to be mostly, not always, but mostly it's there because of the time that I spent in Spain.
Wow. Okay. I love that. Isn't that interesting how, wow, your parents went through so much pain and suffering with discrimination that they, kind of like disconnected from their Spanish roots. And then
Yep.
here you are
Oh, yeah.
connecting back to those Spanish roots.
Well, to the point where because of what they had grown up with and what they were dealing with, my father on census forms would always fill out white.
Wow.
He would never claim Latino. He would never claim Hispanic, even once that became an option with separate ethnicities. And I've always claimed it.
Yeah.
Now, some of it I think is because on my mom's side, her family, they have this history of marrying people from other races, other religions, other countries. And she obviously continued that because she's mostly German with a whole bunch of everything else thrown in. And she married a Puerto Rican. So, and I continued that because I married a guy from another country.
I love that. I love that. Okay, you're continuing the legacy on so many levels, even on the job.
Yep. It's going to be interesting to see what my son does, I got to say.
I love that. Okay. So grew up in journalism, was covering news stories right there with your mom. And how did you land your first job?
Well, that actually goes back to how I fell in love with TV journalism. I was at a summer academic program at Iowa State University in the year between 8th and 9th grade. And was it 8th and 9th? No, it was 9th and 10th. I went for 3 different years. Sorry. It was when I was in high school, between 9th and 10th grade. And it was an earth science program where one week we did astronomy, one week we did geology, one week we did meteorology. Well, the meteorology week, of course, Iowa State at the time owned WITV, and it was right there on campus. So, what are you going to do? You've got kids who are spending the week studying meteorology. You've got a TV station right on campus. Field trip. Go meet the meteorologists, see what they do, see what kind of job it might be. Well, I sat there and I watched the newscast and I fell in love with the news angle of it. the meteorology part, yeah, that's kind of interesting, but I'm not a math person. Never have been. I never will be. I have to look up on the internet every time I need to know it, how to figure out percent increase.
Oh my gosh, it's okay. A lot of journalists are right there with you, me included.
Yep, exactly. I'm a journalist, not an engineer, not a mathematician.
Exactly.
I know my limits.
Yeah. That's hilarious. Okay, I love that.
So yeah, so I went there for that. That's where I fell in love with broadcast news. Went through high school, did everything I could to get ready for it, and then went to Iowa State again for college. They offered me basically a full ride because I was a National Merit Scholar. And because of that, again, WOI TV was right there on campus. And at the time, while I was in college, they were eventually sold to a private company. But when I started, they were still owned by the university. And so beginning of my sophomore year, I walked in, I said, I want to apply for a job. Wow. And I started working there part-time. And I was, depending on the day, I was a camera operator, videotape playback, show editor, teleprompter operator. This is back when the teleprompters were a conveyor belt that you put the physical scripts on. And then there's a camera looking down. So you had to manipulate it with one hand to keep the conveyor belt moving at the right pace. And with the other hand, as space would open up, you'd have to put the next script on. So it's a two-handed operation to run prompter. And anytime I tell kids about that these days, they're like, what?
Seriously, what? Did you mess up a lot? Now I'm just curious. No? Okay, that's good.
Honestly, I learned it in about one day. It was not that, it sounds really, really hard, but it really wasn't. Okay. It was just but you did have to be able to maneuver your two hands independently, and not everybody can do that. That's, if you can't do this, the rub your tummy in one direction and pat your head, or rub your head in the other direction. If you can't do that, you're probably not going to be able to run a conveyor belt prompter very well.
Okay, I think I can do it. Can I?
There you go.
I have to consciously think about this though. This is actually kind of hard.
You have to think about it.
To try it at home.
You have to think about it.
Okay, so landed your first job, and obviously landing that first job is super exciting at the beginning, right?
Especially when you're still in school.
Especially when you're still in school. Exactly.
That was my sophomore year in college. I was only 18. So, but I had my foot in the door, and that was the whole purpose, was the foot in the door. Yeah. And I was willing to do whatever needed to be done. It wasn't what I wanted to do in the long term. I didn't want to be in production, but those were the positions that were available to me, allowed me to have access to the reporters and anchors and learn how to write from them. I mean, we had a Peabody award-winning journalist who was one of our main anchors. I learned how to write from him.
That's amazing.
That's not something you're going to get in most classrooms. And not to mention the day-to-day experience that I was able to pick up because of that. Our senior year, one of the last classes that you take, at least when I was there, that you took at Iowa State before you graduated, was a practicum where you put on a newscast once a week. We did a newscast once a week. So many of the kids couldn't get their stories done. They had a whole week.
Wow.
But by then I had 3 years of experience turning stuff around on day turns.
Wow.
In one way or another. So my concept of what could be done and their concept of what could be done were totally different already at that point. And then when I graduated, WI hired me full-time, first as a photographer and then a one-man band, then producer, then an assignment editor, assistant news director. Yeah. I stayed there for like 8 years all told. So
you've been extremely advanced and ahead of the game way before anyone else. So. That's beautiful. Pilar, okay, so with all that knowledge also though, come certain challenges being in news, right? Mm-hmm. When do you think you faced like one of the first very difficult situations in a newsroom that maybe made you question the career in the industry?
I don't think it ever made me question it, but it certainly gave me a certain level of PTSD that I still struggle with to this day. Not very often, because most of us don't use live bands anymore. Mm-hmm. But even 6, 7, 8 years ago, when we were still using live bands on the regular, it wasn't even necessarily the using of the live bands that was a problem. It was the training that we had to do. When I was in my very first year at WI, full-time after graduating college, We had a live van accident. And we had a young lady who was on the desk who was, I don't think she was even fully out of college yet.
Okay.
And didn't have much experience on the desk. She was filling in, I think, on that at that point. And I was originally, because there were only like 3 of us who were full-time photographers fully trained on the van at that point, small staff. And I was originally supposed to run the live shot that day for one of our new one-man vans. Okay, not a problem. It's part of the job. But then I come in and she says, "Oh, I need you to go pick up this VOSAT." And I'm like, "Okay, do we have time?" "Oh yeah, no problem, no problem." And I figured she's timed it out. Well, it turned out she hadn't. She forgot that I was supposed to do the live shot. And she sent me out to pick up this VOSAT with AAA about, I think it was, I don't know, obviously some travel thing, I think like coming up holiday or something. But I get back and the newsroom is dead silent. She's sitting at the desk crying. I'm like, what the hell is going on? Because I wasn't there, I was the only photographer that day who was available and trained to run the band. So they sent out another one-man band, 2 one-man bands, neither of which had been at the station for longer than 3 months. One of them had only been there for about a month, running a live shot by themselves. They put the mast up into a 50,000 volt power line. The reporter, the one-man band who was reporting, he was going over his script while holding the switch that puts the mast up. So he was the one who was there, who was directly impacted. He actually didn't suffer as much damage. He had some damage to that arm that was holding the switch, but that was it. Because the explosion of the contact actually threw him free, and he landed on the ground kind of half under the van. Kim, who was over setting up camera for the actual live shot, she was playing photog for that live shot, heard the explosion, turns around, sees him under the van smoking, and goes running to help him. Instinct, not trained, not knowing. You stay away and you call 911.
Yeah.
And she reaches him, she bends over to grab him and pull him out from under, touches the top of her head to the van and completes the circuit. We didn't know she was in a medically induced coma for 1 or 2 weeks after that. We didn't know if she was going to survive, and if she did survive, if she was going to have some sort of permanent mental damage because of it. She did eventually come back to a certain extent. She had serious damage down one side of her face. She had multiple reconstructive surgeries. The last time I saw her, and this was at least a decade or so ago, she wore a wig still to help cover the damage and some of the hair loss from that damage. So that was tough. And what made it even tougher is that it wasn't even 6 months later, there was another live van accident in Los Angeles at the station that I had done my internship at, involving people that I had worked with during my internship at KABC. And they called, of course, newspapers doing the story. I don't even remember which one it was, LA Times, something like that. I don't remember. But they called the station. I happened to be the one who picked up the phone and wanted comment from us. And that's how I found out that it even happened. And it was people that I knew. And so, yeah, to this day, watching watching a live van mast go up in the air is hard for me. The Look Up and Live video, which was used for training for the next decade and a half after that, I cannot watch it. I cannot watch it. I get the shakes. I can't breathe, basic panic attack. And all anybody else sees is the, a 3-second shot of our mast touching the power line. That's all they see, is the mast touching the power line. What I see, because I was the one who edited the story that night, I stayed late. Everybody else went to the hospital. I stayed. Our news director actually put the story together. The other stations gave us their video. They actually even offered us their anchors and reporters to do our shows. And we said, well, we'll do our own shows, but we'll take the video. And I remember our news director, she was notorious for not being able to write a story under 2 minutes long and always turning the script in late. I knew it was going to be a headache to edit because I hadn't shot anything of it. And so I remember while I was waiting for the script, sitting there scrolling through the video. And there's one shot that always sticks with me. And that's the shot that I see every time that Look Up and Live video plays. It's two firefighters carrying Kim. One has her under her shoulders, one has her under her knees. They didn't even wait for a stretcher. That's how urgent they were to get her into the freaking ambulance.
Yeah.
And she looked like a dead body, just completely limp. No signs of life from her whatsoever. But I remember scrolling through that video with tears streaming down my face. That's the only shot I remember from that video. But I will never forget that shot. And that's what I see instead of masks going up, instead of that one little clip that's in the Look Up and Live video that's very clean cut and not traumatic to anybody else whatsoever. But that's not what I see. I see the shot of my friend being carried to the ambulance like a rag doll. So yeah, that was kind of the first time that things got heavy for me in this business. And that's interesting because when I was in college, you know, I had been there I had been in TV working at the station when the Oklahoma City bombing happened. I remember I had done the morning show. I had gone because it was right on campus. I could do the morning shows and then go do my morning classes and come back and do the midday show. And so I came back in for my shift is on the midday show. And there's nobody in the newsroom at a time when, you know, right before a show, newsroom should be bustling, especially back then. You're pulling scripts off of printers. And that was back when we still ripped scripts because they would print with the carbon copies and you had to rip them apart and all that sort of stuff. And, you know, it should have been really, really busy. And it was empty, silent. And I'm like, what the? And I look up at that bank of TV monitors that every newsroom has, and it's the same shot across the board, that aerial shot from a helicopter of the Murrah building just caved in. And I just remember my stomach hitting the floor and running into the studio thinking, oh my God, they're going to need me because we got to get on air right now. They'd already long since gone to air. But so I had been through a couple of big stories already where I was in the newsroom and I had seen kind of some of the really serious stuff that we have to deal with, but it didn't really hit me personally until that live event accident. And that was the point when I was like, okay, it never really made me rethink the industry or my job. It did make me take a different look at safety, be a little less concerned with being first and a little more concerned with making sure we're okay. A little less concerned with having that best shot, which anybody who watches my reporting will say, but you're crazy. You go out there and walk in floodwaters. Well, I've got training for that. I have gear for that. I don't recommend everybody do it. You know, it's what people don't understand is it looks like I'm taking crazy risks, but they're actually always very carefully considered risks on my part. And as far as my flood coverage, I've had lots of arguments with a couple of local firefighters who just absolutely hate the fact that I do that. But I've got the training, so I'm going to do it. I've got the safety equipment, so I'm going to do it. Because if it's visual, people are more likely to watch, they're more likely to pay attention. And I can't tell you the number of times I have seen people underestimate how deep floodwaters are because they're not demonstrated to them that, listen, just because it looks flat here does not mean it's flat down there. Show and tell, name of the game.
Wow.
The reason we do what we do.
Pilar, there's so much that you've went through so many years in this career, right? But this story is definitely one for the books and one of a lot of pain and suffering. And I'm sorry that you went through that. And it's really courageous on your end to speak about it. I don't have a lot of experience with live vans just because when I came into the industry, live views and TV views were already being used. Thank God.
Well, they've got their own dangers, and that's the thing, especially for older folks like me who've been there and there. They're like, oh, it's not a live van. We don't have to worry about putting the mast into a power line anymore. Yeah, you still got to worry about attracting lightning. Just saying.
Yeah. Do you want to go a little bit into safety one-on-one with the live van, just to explain to those reporters or people who are listening that don't know exactly how it's supposed to be used effectively to avoid those kind of scenarios? Because you mentioned 2 incidents already, but I know there's been plenty of incidents
Yep.
with reporters and live bands.
Yeah, in the late 90s, for some reason, we had a series of incidents. There hadn't been any for quite some time. And then all of a sudden, we had several of them, boom, 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 across the country.
Do you
And
think that
that's,
it was like neglectful behavior from newsrooms sending people
I
out?
do. It was a lack of training. It was a lack of training. I mean, my training, and I was one of 3 in our newsroom who's considered fully trained,
Mhm.
was about a day. Basically, go through, run you through how to set everything up, and then have me run 2 or 3 live shots that day. That was my training. After that, I was considered fully trained. There was never a word in my training about being wary of power lines. I was never warned about that. And I had pretty typical training. And in fact, our station took some fairly serious and hefty OSHA fines because of that accident. And the training after that changed. And once again, I was one of about 3 at the station who were fully certified under the new training,
Which is
which
interesting,
was
right?
much more in depth. You
Yeah.
know, the look up and live, check to make sure you're at least 50 feet away, how to make sure you're far enough away from lightning. You know, I remember about a year, not even a year later, maybe half a year later, after we'd gone through all the retraining and everything, and we were out covering the Drake relays, and sports was live from the Drake relays. Okay, great. We do the commercial break. Blue skies, not a cloud in sight, sunny, beautiful day. And all of a sudden, lightning, thunder with lightning, less than a 30 count away. It's too close. And I'm on the 2-way to the engineer who was down at the van yelling, drop the mast, before I even told the station what was going on. My first instinct was get that mast down now. And then I called the station and told them, live shot is dead. You've got no sports. So they did the tease live. Thank God, sports guy number 2, and he had shot most of the video. He had 30 seconds warning that he was going to have to do sports from set.
Wow.
He still yells at me about that to this day, but I wouldn't take it back for a second. It just is too dangerous.
No, of course. And it's interesting, you mentioned a great point going back to neglectful, I guess, decisions from newsrooms to send people out into certain situations without training. That we don't have to wait for a near-death experience for things to change and trainings to become part of newsrooms, right?
Yeah.
Training needs to start happening.
Well, and I'll be honest, I think some of that should also be part of college. I mean, I'm sorry, but there was no training on live bands the entire time I was in college. And I was studying specifically for broadcast media. We learned how to run a reel-to-reel. I wasn't going to be on radio, but not a word about live bands. You know, and Iowa State was one of, at least at the time, the Greenlee School was one of the top 5 journalism schools in the country. Great on the academics, great on the writing, great on the journalism aspect, not so much on the technical stuff. And I think that's something that the entire industry kind of tends to overlook a little bit. And yet that's where one of the biggest dangers is. Obviously, we've got a whole nother danger nowadays with people hating the media and trying to shoot us. That's a whole nother story.
Yeah. Which I guess leads me to the next question that we're going to go into as well. But I think I'll bring up a couple of points of something you mentioned at the end when I ask you what we can improve on in the news industry. But this is one great point, right? Training and safety, especially in live vans and other technical equipment. So you also covered the death of news reporter Alison Parker and photojournalist Adam Ward. They were shot and killed by a former reporter at their news stations who had been fired in 2013 for disruptive conduct. And after, I believe, a 5-hour manhunt, he shot himself during a car chase with police and died later in the hospital. But Allison and Adam ended up dying that August 26, 2015. I don't remember if they died the same day of the shooting or
they died instantly.
They died instantly, right? And
The woman that she was interviewing did survive.
Yeah.
Because they were shot live on air in the middle of a live interview for the morning show.
Okay. Do you want to go into details of that story and how you covered it and how that was for you?
Sure. My participation in that was less as a journalist and more as support. I did do some journalism there. Don't get me wrong. I did cover it, but that was secondary. It started that morning. I was at the doctor's office and was getting ready to check out, and they knew I worked for the news, and they said, "Have you heard what's going on?" Because I was working in Wichita. Remember, I've been in Kansas for over 20 years, and this was out of Virginia. And I'm like, "What are you talking about?" They're like, "Oh, the two people, I don't know, somewhere on the East Coast got killed during a live newscast." I'm like, "Huh?" And I look up and it's there. And so I'm hearing about it. They have it on their TV that they had on all the time. So I'm hearing about it for the first time just as my cell phone is ringing. And it's my manager asking if I could be available to leave the state for at least a week and be able to leave within an hour. Well, anybody who knows me knows I've always got a go bag in my car. I can go at any time, anywhere. I literally carry my passport with me just in case. And so my answer, of course, was yes. That was part of why they called me. The other part is because by then I am kind of an elder statesman in the business. I've been in the business for well over a decade at that point, going on 2. And they knew that I had been through some other things. They knew about my issues because I had gotten a pass for not watching the training video again for live vans. So they knew I had been through a similar incident with somebody at the station being hurt, at least.
Yeah.
And so it ended up within a couple of hours, I was on a plane to Roanoke, and I was there by that afternoon. Our station was owned by the same company that owned WDBJ at the time. And I'm very proud of the way Shirts, which was the corporation, how they reacted and handled things. They got folks from all of their different stations, and they got us in the air and out there ASAP. We were there to help by that evening. My comment from the very beginning with this was, we're here to do whatever it is you need us to do. If you need us to clean the bathrooms, we'll clean the bathrooms. If you need us to handle phone calls coming in from the outside and PR request type stuff, that's what we'll do. You need us to fill in on air, etc., that's what we'll do. We sent producers, we sent reporters, we sent anchors, just kind of a broad swath of people that just help wherever they were needed. 3 people from Wichita went. I'm the only one who's still in the business. Well, actually, you know what? Pat might be in the business. He might have just left the market. One of the producers who went. The other one is in PR now. But sorry, I digress. It happens when you're telling stories like this. Sometimes you get too bogged down in the details. We were there that afternoon.
Well, it's part of the story, I think, right? Part of that trauma is often leads people to leave the news industry.
That's true. That's true. Yeah, a lot of people leave the news industry. In fact, most of the people who were on air at that point at WDBJ, there were a lot of them who are out of the business entirely now, on air and off. A lot of them have left the industry. Wow. But I think I remember the first few days I was there, what our station back here had me do was just like little vignettes or whip arounds, just kind of scene setters. This is what's going on here. This is what we're doing right now type thing that I could basically shoot on my cell phone and send back. And what had developed throughout the day was the hashtag We Stand with WDBJ. And someone at the station had realized it was happening and started printing them out and posting them all over a wall, one wall in the newsroom. And it was there. And I remember doing that first whip around, and I could feel the pain in the room. It was like coming in waves, and I was okay when I started. And then by the time I finished, my voice was cracking up. I could barely hold it together. That's what it's like when things like that happen. And I remember later I was working as a photographer for one of their one-man bands. They didn't want to send anybody out solo. at the time, which understandable. Even though by the end of the day, they knew that nobody else was in danger, it was an emotional thing. And so I went with him as his photographer and helped him shoot and helped him put stuff together. And we got back to the station and he did his first hit, and he came back and he was all upset because his voice had cracked. He had lost his composure. He wasn't the emotionless newsman. And I'm like, that's okay. It's all right to be human on air. It wasn't the first time we've seen that. What was it that made Walter Cronkite so beloved? It wasn't that he had a good news face. Mm-hmm. It was moments like when he announced Kennedy's assassination, and he couldn't do it without breaking up. He was human. I've done that since then, where I've had moments on air where I could not hold it together because the story was that emotionally impactful. We had an officer shot, and I'd never met the man, but he was a sheriff's deputy, and it was my end of town, and not just my end of town, but the end of town where I had taught. And many of my students, when I was teaching, had been close friends with him. And so when I was sitting in the funeral, I was sitting with a bunch of my former students. And so it hit me again. And so as we were doing kind of the coverage afterward, as they were taking him from the church to the burial ground, we're kind of covering it almost like a parade. Except not quite as happy, of course, obviously. And they would come back to me just to kind of, because we hadn't had cameras in the church during the funeral service, just to kind of provide a little bit of context and texture and of what had been going on. And there were a couple times when I lost it. And I just, I was just upfront with him. I didn't know Robert Coonsey, but I know a lot of people that he very obviously touched in his career, including many of my former students. We're human beings. And I think oftentimes that search for objectivity, and I think there's a time and a role. I mean, I'm a political reporter. It's important for my own political feelings not to be part of my story. But I think transparency as well. Yes, we are human beings. We feel things. We don't report on this stuff. I've seen people go home not even being directly there, but like with some of these recent shootings with these young kids, like Uvalde, people go home and cry. And they weren't even in the same city. They weren't actually physically covering it. I can't imagine. Actually, I can't imagine what the reporters there are going through. This business can be very, very emotionally heavy. And that is one of the reasons, even when I started in the business, and I don't know what the numbers are now, but back in the 90s, the average amount of time somebody spent in this business was 3 years. And pay is only a small part of it. Yeah, pay sucks, the hours suck. We all know that.
Yeah.
But the emotional difficulties that go with this job are hugely part of it.
Yeah, which leads me to make the statement that journalists are first responders too. Mm-hmm. And oftentimes we're not even trained nearly well enough to deal with these traumatic events.
Mm-hmm. There's a reason for the old stereotype of the drunk journalist who has a bottle of scotch in the drawer. Mm-hmm. Because for many people for a long time, that was the only way to deal with things. I know at one point I left because of secondary stress trauma. Ironically enough, it wasn't the PTSD from dealing with the live van accident that made me leave the business. One of the factors that led to me leaving when I did the first time, I've actually left the business twice. Mm-hmm. The first time by choice because I needed to for my own mental health was the hearings after BTK was arrested. I was a manager at that point. I was the one, we aired the hearings gavel to gavel, middle of the day, of a serial killer.
Yeah.
So we had to be very careful. There were a lot of things we could not air. It was just too graphic, especially a lot of the photos, et cetera, that were entered into evidence. And so we aired on a 7-second delay. We had a couple of criminal attorneys in-house to provide commentary, and an anchor on set, and they were on standby. And if I was the one who was watching it, and I had to decide, okay, this is getting too graphic. We got to go back to studio. You guys got to fill for a little bit. Okay, now you can go back. Things are safe. What that means is I saw everything.
Yeah.
And having been a photographer, I'm a very visual person. So as he's describing in very calm, gentle, unemotional terms what he did, I'm seeing it, and I'm seeing it from the victim's perspectives. And I had nightmares for the next year. I worked out my contract, but after that hearing was over, I walked into my news director and I said, I won't be resigning. Okay. And they understood. Yeah. But that next year was hard. And I needed the break. At that point, I had been in the business for 13 years. Since I was 18 years old, I had been going 110% the entire time. That's just my personality. Mm-hmm. Whatever I do, I give it everything I've got, and then a few things I don't, which is another thing that a lot of journalists need to, I'm in my late 40s and finally starting to train myself out of that. And I'm very proud to see a lot of the new generation of journalists coming in with better boundaries than I had.
I love that. How so? Can you go a little bit into detail about that? How you're training yourself to have better boundaries?
Well, for me, some of it was when I went back to my church. I'm Seventh-day Adventist, and for a long time I was not practicing for a number of reasons, and I won't get into those here. But when I ended up going back to my church and keeping Sabbath, that was huge for me. Not work a 24-hour period where not only do I not work, I don't check work emails, I don't look at work social media, I don't look at the news. I cut it all off for 24 hours. That's a huge, huge mental health benefit right there. I am very careful to use all of my vacation unless I'm trying to save vacation days for a special trip the next year. I never have carryovers. I use my vacation days. I use my personal days because that time off is vital. And there are times when I get called that I say no. My time off is my time off, and I need that time off.
Yeah.
And one thing that I've done for me is I now see a therapist regularly. I don't see one. I'm still old school in this. I don't see one that's paid for by the station. I don't trust corporations not to get involved somehow. Now HIPAA has helped with that to a certain extent, and things have definitely changed. Cultures have changed. But when I started in this business, if you were to admit that you were seeing a therapist because of this business, you would not get your contract re-signed. When your contract was up, they'd be like, "Nah, we don't need you anymore because you're not strong enough to deal with the business." But if you drank yourself to sleep every night because of what you're dealing with, that's fine. He just likes his alcohol. He's a wine lover. Whatever. It's like, which one's a little bit healthier here, folks?
Yeah, what's the healthier coping mechanism?
Exactly.
Numbing yourself with alcohol or talking about it to release the trauma. Yeah.
Yep.
Wow. I'm really proud of you for taking those steps to take care of yourself, to see a therapist, because it's not oftentimes we see journalists actually make it 20 years in the news industry.
Yep.
And if they do,
we're the unicorns of the business.
And if they do make it the 20 years, you're right. A lot of them do cope with alcohol. I remember going to major events, presidential elections and news coverage, where at night, if there was a lot of journalists who traveled to cover certain events, they would all meet at the bar and drink until 3 a.m. And then we had to wake up at like 5, 6 a.m. to start the news coverage again. And it's like, how are you even functioning?
Yep. And honestly, just lost an anchor that I worked with for several years to alcohol-related disease.
Wow.
Yeah.
Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
I don't know that that's necessarily my story to tell.
Okay.
Uh,
Yeah, I
but
appreciate that.
he was a very well-known anchor in the area, at least. And he, yeah, he was the one who always had the bottle of liquor in his drawer. I don't know that he ever actually drank at work, because we actually had there are FCC regulations involved. But yeah,
Yeah,
he
that's
he
okay. We don't.
struggled with it, and it ended up killing him.
Wow. Well, if any journalist who is listening to this and is coping with alcohol to get through the industry
Or drugs.
or drugs, yes, there's definitely better ways to cope. Hopefully, you can listen to this podcast to know you're not alone in these feelings and that there's help and support. You can get better with boundaries. You can seek mental counseling. I do it too, and I love it. And I'm all for it because it's helped me process so much trauma.
Yeah.
I left the news industry. It's going to be almost 2 years since I left, and I'm still dealing with a lot of grief from shootings, explosions, deaths. And what I learned with traditional Chinese medicine is that anxiety and lack of breathing comes from your lungs, and lungs store sadness and grief. So this is an example of why a lot of journalists, and it's not the only example, but it's one of many, right? Why many journalists, for example, suffer with anxiety. It's because of all the grief and sadness of unprocessed trauma with everything we see. So definitely seek counseling. And I don't know if you have any other advice for people that are listening as well. What else do you do to
Seek other outlets. We tend to be very creative people in broadcast journalism, especially. For me, it was cross stitch, quilting, things like that gave me outlets. And at various times in my life, fiction writing, not news writing, but fiction writing, where I could develop characters and I could work through the emotions and the feelings through those characters and what they were dealing with, and explore different possible outcomes. Well, if he does this, then what? If she does that, then what? And that really made a big difference for me.
I love that. I love that. Pilar, I think we've been talking for almost an hour now. Is there anything that I haven't asked you that you maybe want to talk about a little bit or go into detail about?
Well, I guess my last piece of advice is there is the old adage, concentrate on the positive. I'm not saying we shouldn't take care of ourselves when the bad shit happens, because it does. And we do need to take care of ourselves for that. But at the same time, constantly dwelling on some of that stuff actually makes it worse. And that's the one thing that I found. We've got to work through it. Yes, you don't want to ignore it.
Yeah.
But then continually just living in that memory is not healthy. Instead, it's finding those good memories. One of them for me was, and this again goes back to my days at WOI, the movie Twister was partially shot in Ames, in and around the Ames area in Iowa, where we happen to have our morning shows and midday shows broadcast at the Ames studio, and our evening shows are broadcast out of a studio in Des Moines, which is where the rest of the stations were at. It's one of those split markets. And because of that, if you remember the movie Twister, he's supposed to have gotten a job as a TV meteorologist instead of a storm chaser. And they actually shot this huge involved scene at our station. And I wasn't actually in it because I had another job. I was working 3 jobs that summer. I had another job I had to go to, so I couldn't stay for the shooting, but I was there while they were setting up and helping and everything. And I was the same height and coloring as one of the anchors that they were going to use. And so they used me to set the lights. And so I was just kind of sitting there at the desk, blah, blah, blah. And this guy, he's been walking around, swinging back and forth with a golf club. And he comes up and just starts talking to me. And we sit there and chat for like half an hour while they're setting the lights. And then he walks away and I get off, they're done with me. I get off and one of our other part-timers comes up to me and goes, how do you know Bill Paxton? I'm like, huh? I've been talking with Bill Paxton for half an hour with no idea who it was. And my husband was an he wasn't my husband then, he was a student at Iowa State for aviation engineering. He's huge into space stuff. Absolutely adores Apollo 13, which Bill Paxton had been in.
Yeah.
So, and my husband's birthday was coming up. So I had nothing. I just go grab a reporter notebook and run. And I said, listen, my husband's birthday is coming up. He loves you at Apollo 13. Can I get an autograph? And he's like, yeah, sure. He gives me an autograph, signs off, blah, blah, blah. And my husband has that piece of paper framed in his office to this day.
I love that.
Those are the stories that keep us going.
Yeah.
I did a series when I do political reporting. A lot of my political reporting these days is actually what we call special projects, where I spend a lot of time, researching, akin to investigative reporting. I spend a lot of time researching and digging up and then going out and getting interviews. It takes way more than a day to do a story.
Yeah.
Some of these take months. And there was a series that I did on suspended licenses that pretty much everybody at the State House says it was my series of stories that changed state law. That they had been trying to do this for years, but couldn't get enough buy-in until my story started illustrating what was happening because of the number of suspended driver's licenses we have in the state of Kansas for non-driving related offenses. Had nothing to do with driving, and yet they'd lost their license over it. And how that was hurting our economy, and not just the individuals, but the entire state. Yeah. From people being able to work to insurance rates for everybody. And because of my stories, state laws changed. Hopefully not done changing, because they didn't go as far as most people would want them to go. But you know how lawmakers are. They got to go a little bit.
Yeah, but you create a change. It's a ripple effect. You create a change, and that must have been so rewarding.
I'm a political reporter.
Yeah, you influence.
I am very, very, very careful to keep my own personal political opinions out of what I do. But I have a picture of the governor in my office. Now, it's not just the governor. It's me and my executive producer at the time with the governor, with the law that was signed into law because of our stories.
I love
and that's in the office.
That's amazing.
So that I don't forget. That's my why. That's why I do what I do. You know, I have always said since day one, you referenced journalists as first responders. And I was raised on the concept of journalists as the muckraker journalist, the investigative journalist, the one who makes changes for the better. Woodward and Bernstein, Upton Sinclair, folks like that. And Murphy Brown, you know, those were the folks that I was raised with to think about when I thought about journalism. To me, journalism is public service just as much as any other first responder.
Yeah.
You know, I know so many people see us when we show up at crime scenes, when we show up at natural disasters, and they think, oh, vultures. Well, actually, no, there's a purpose for us being here. Because if we're here letting everybody else know what's going on, two things. One, everybody else knows where the need is. They're more likely to help if they're aware of the need and are emotionally captivated by the need. And that's where the visuals and individual stories come in. So that's a huge role that we play. And two, by broadcasting what's going on, we're keeping a lot of the looky-loos away, which allows the first responders to do their jobs. Mm-hmm. Because when you've got a bunch of people just showing up to figure out what the hell's going on, the people that are trained to deal with the situation can't deal with it properly. So we actually do serve a purpose, no matter what some folks may think. And that purpose, helping people get the information they need to live their best lives and make the best decisions for them, is why I do what I do. And it's why I keep coming back, even though I've left. I left once because I needed to leave. I left once. I guess you could say it was because I needed to leave too, but it wasn't about this. It was about physical. I have arthritis that started in my 20s. Okay. And I've been a one-man band. I refuse to use the term multimedia journalist because that's a lie designed to make people think that it's a good job rather than doing two jobs for the price of one.
Exactly.
Or really not even a full one, doing two jobs for the price of 3/4.
How do you feel about one-man bands?
I don't mind one-man banding. I don't think it should be the norm.
Okay.
That's my issue.
Yeah.
Is we are putting too many kids in danger by sending them out by themselves.
Yeah.
I can remember doing door knocks. And another issue that happens with one-man banding is we're asking them to do two jobs for one person. I'm sorry, I'm a good photographer. I'm a good reporter. But when I'm doing both of them at the same time, both suffer. I can either, when I'm doing an interview as a one-man band, I can either be paying attention to the technical aspects, making sure the lighting is good, making sure they stay in focus, making sure my audio is still coming in, that sort of stuff. Or I can be getting the information and paying close attention to the information and asking follow-up questions. I've had news directors say, I send you out for one story and you come back with 5. I only did the one interview.
Yeah.
But it's about asking the questions. And when when somebody says something interesting, like, wait a minute, okay, now you said something about this being a 500-year drought. What are you talking about?
Yeah.
What does that mean? Are we, that was one of them where I was sent in to interview our water folks on one story, and just a stray comment they made in the process of answering unveiled a whole different story. Because I was working with a photographer on that story, I was able to pay enough attention to that interview that I caught it at the time instead of later on when I was going back over it back at the station, and was able to immediately ask the follow-up questions. They didn't have time to sit there and come up with a cover story of any sort. Exactly. And they just answered. And boom, I walk out of there with a way bigger story than I walked in on. Way bigger.
Exactly.
And those are the things that we lose by having one-man bands. One-man bands, in my opinion, should be used for, a person should only be one-man banding on simple stories. Mm-hmm. They should never have to do live shots related to the story. And anytime they're used for breaking news, for crime news, for live shots, they should be working with a photographer throughout the day.
Completely agree. Yeah, completely agree. And you're right. We do lose a lot of valuable information or stories for sending out one-man bands on certain interviews, because they can only focus on, I got to put the camera up, I got to edit this, I got to write the story, I got to drive to the story, I got to book the interviews. So we're missing out.
And I think another thing that we're really missing out is also we're seeing a degradation in the visual quality of what it is that we produce. Because two things. One, they don't walk out with the training of a full photographer, and they don't get the training of a full photographer once they're here. I spent almost a year as a full photographer. That's all I did was a photographer. I learned lighting, I learned audio, I learned all those things. So once I started one-man banding, while I still had to pay attention to them, it wasn't the same as if I was coming in cold, if that makes any sense. And so I was able to concentrate a little bit more on my reporting, even as a one-man band, than somebody who's coming straight out of college, hasn't had that time where they've trained in just one job, and they're having to suddenly do both.
Yeah. Wow. I love that. Great point. Pilar, I think
we've already went over time.
This has been more than enough. More than I even expected speaking with you. Thank you for sharing all your wisdom, all your knowledge, all your experiences, how we can improve the news industry. Safety is definitely a huge must that we need to prioritize. And I thank you for your service, because you've changed laws and you've caused so much good along the communities that you've been reporting on and covering. So even, going out to newsrooms to help and give support for the death of Alison and Adam, that's already huge. I mean, I know all of the reporters, as soon as we heard about it, even if we didn't know them or weren't there, we were all traumatized by the incident, I'm pretty sure, because I know I was.
Yeah, the whole industry was traumatized by it. There's no doubt about that.
Yeah. So thank you for being there and supporting the people that went through that. And thank you for also honoring yourself and taking care of yourself so that you can continue to do a great job and give a great service.
You're welcome.
Journalists, this one's for you, to help you heal, to help you understand your worth, and to help you know you're not alone. So share the love and subscribe to Spotify and YouTube and follow us on Instagram. The Awakened Journalist is proud to present Media Healers by Emiliana Molina Fajardo.